Mr. Bison flips. Mr. Bison flips. Mr. Bison flips. Mr. Bison flips.
Welcome to this video where we're going to talk about psychoanalysis, and it's kind of an introduction into critical literary theory. We don't generally do a lot of theory criticism in high school English, simply because it's more of a college skill, but also because we're less interested, I guess, in how well you can apply the thinking of others, and we tend to do more what's called reader response theory in high school, where we allow you, the reader, to show us how you understand the text and what you think the text is about. So that's the main reason why we don't do so much critical theory. If you think of what critical theory is, essentially it's like putting a filter between you and the text. So rather than just you giving the text a straight reading and saying what it's about, you kind of put on, I guess another maybe better metaphor is putting on a pair of glasses, right? Putting on different lenses and seeing the text from a different light. So what would a Marxist person think about this text? Or what would a feminist think about this text? Or what would a psychoanalyst think about this text? And that's kind of what we're going to try to do today, to kind of just give you we're not going to analyze the text today, but we're going to explore the tools of psychoanalysis and the main thinkings in that theory, so that you can then use that to apply the text that we study. The most prominent thinker and the father of psychoanalysis is the Swiss psychologist Sigmund Freud. He articulated these ideas, or the seeds of them at least, in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And essentially, his ideas have a lot to do with human repression and how we repress ideas and kind of try to hide them away in our own psyche. And the ideas of the unconscious and things that we're not aware of that rule our lives. He's probably most famous for his borrowing the idea from Sophocles of the hero of Oedipus and the Oedipal complex. Oedipus, of course, is famous for his act of falling in love with his mother, marrying his mother, killing his father, and then falling in love with and fathering children by his mother. That's kind of, and the female equivalent would be the Electra complex. Both of these entail that all young men kind of grow up. So in Oedipus complex is about young men growing up and desiring to essentially marry their mother, but looking for a wife who is similar to their mother. And Electra would be the same thing, that girls growing up being jealous of the mothers and aspiring to marry their fathers or find someone like their father. But we don't need to kind of go into that in any great depth. It's more about this second quote, the quote from Freud here, about human beings motivated and driven by desires, fears, or needs, or conflicts of which we are unaware. That kind of generated this iceberg idea of his that we're going to explore in the next slide, where our human psyche is kind of made up of these three components, and this conflicting idea between the unconscious on the one hand and the conscious. And there's this constant battle going on with the conscious things that we are aware of in our psyche, and the unconscious ideas that actually drive us, but that we're not fully aware of. We'll look a bit more at that in the next slide. So when Freud articulated his theories, he kind of distinguished between the conscious and the unconscious mind. And he used the iceberg metaphor to represent that, because as we all know, an iceberg, only some 10% is visible above the sea, and the majority of it is underwater. Similarly, he was saying that we are only conscious of our motivators to a very small extent. Most of what drives us as humans is hidden away in our unconscious mind. And then he divided that into three different parts of our psyche that motivates us. The main impulsive and the primitive driving force that kind of acts as a strong motivator for us is the id, what he called the id. And that's essentially our urges, our natural, raw, impulsive urges. Things like eating, sex, and aggression is kind of tucked away in there. It's kind of irrational, and it's motivated mainly by a pain-pleasure principle. We seek pleasure and we try to avoid pain. And that's tucked away, obviously, there from our Stone Age pre-communication ages. To contrast that, we have the superego. That is our inner moral compass. If you think of that kind of the traditional video cartoon metaphor of having an angel and a devil on your shoulders. That's kind of what I try to represent through those two emojis there. We have on the one hand the id that is kind of, in a sense, it's not evil, but it's not thoughtful, whereas the superego is all about morality and about conscience and about doing the right thing. And so if we do not do the right thing, then the superego will generate a sense of guilt and anxiety in us because we know that what we're doing is not right. And then we have essentially our sense of the real I, our true self, which is the ego. And that's kind of what's there to balance these two out. So we have to kind of constantly think about and make choices in our lives based on both our id and our superego. And the ego itself is then choosing which of these two should be the driving force. So it's a really interesting thing to do when you study literature, to think about, okay, what is it that motivates this particular character? Is this character conscious of this choice? Is he doing this because he's morally thinking this through, or is this a kind of an id driving this character to make these decisions? So when it becomes interesting to really use the psychoanalytical lens to explore characters in a text is when you start thinking about the character's motivations, right? So first of all, you can think about, big picture, is this character driven by their id or their superego, or is there a balanced kind of ego making choices here? But then try to think about, so what does this all mean? Is this character kind of repressing things? So Freud said that repression doesn't eliminate our painful experiences and emotions. We unconsciously behave in ways that will allow us to play out our conflicting feelings about the painful experiences and emotions that we repress. So what would that look like for the characters that we study? If we keep all these things tucked away, Freud was looking at different ways for us to kind of deal with these this kind of internal conflict. So characters might show that they are not dealing with their emotions correctly by a range of things. For instance, they might be selective in what they perceive. They might be selective in terms of what they remember. They might be in full-on denial. They might be showing some kind of displacement of emotion, taking them from one object and then showing that emotion towards something else and projecting it onto someone else or something else. There might be an element of regression, going backwards in their life and kind of being more less mature, or going back to some previous stage of their existence. Or they might be showing some sense of some fear of intimacy, whether on a relational basis or in some other capacity. Or they might simply seem as if they're really fearful of dying and show their kind of repression, suppression of emotions in that way. So it's interesting to kind of look at, okay, so what motivates this character, and how does his or her the way that they're dealing with emotions manifest itself in their actions. So when we apply this theory, we want to kind of look for, I guess, things that would have happened in a character's past. It might have been trauma. It might have something to do with their dreams, or these being spoiled or in some way hindered. Or it might be, Freud would love to look into your relationship with your parent, particularly if you're a girl with your father, or if you're a boy with your mother, and relationships there. But essentially look at the trauma, and then look at these things on this list as kind of defense mechanisms, right? And so say I come to my psychologist and I say that I'm a nail biter, and he would then kind of look into, so what is this? If you look back in your past, maybe this is a way for you to project your anxiety about something. So we look back into my childhood. Okay, so something happened when you were young, and you felt some sense of security by biting on things, and then now that you've let go of your teethers and everything, then your nails is the closest thing to biting on, and therefore this is kind of your way of projecting that anxiety. So we're kind of looking at the characters and seeing, okay, so this person is displacing or projecting their anxiety or their trauma or whatever it might be onto something else as a way of defending themselves and not being vulnerable. The other seminal figure behind psychoanalysis that we have to mention is Carl Jung. Again, a psychologist living roughly in the same era as, a little bit later than Freud, but they certainly overlapped and had got a lot of discussion about psychoanalysis. But his main contribution to the idea of psychoanalytical literary theory is the kind of concept of the archetypes. So essentially, Jung's theory was rejecting the traditional view of a tabula rasa, that every human being is a blank slate, and that when we're born we have an unlimited opportunity in terms of what we might become and what we might achieve in our lives. He thought that we were already archetypally um, projected into a certain role in our lives. So if you were a woman, you were going to be the maiden, the mother, or the essentially the hag or the witch, and you only had a certain number of prospects. A young man can only be either the hero or the villain, etc. So there's kind of all these. Essentially, you got a bit of a graphic down here on how these character types might manifest themselves. I'm not going to spend extensive time on this because for our current unit of study, these are not overly relevant, but it's really useful to be aware of the archetypes because they are certainly useful when it comes to defining literary characters and who they are and what role they play in texts. So the application of Jungian theory might be when you analyze characters, you can see kind of what traditional archetype they fit into, which is often a useful way to defining characters. And it can also be a way to seeing that maybe in a postmodern way, how an author chooses to break the characters out of those archetypes and create something new. So they can be a useful tool and kind of another lens to use when you view characters. So where would you slot this character into the types of character types, um, and what is new about this particular character? That concludes our basic overview of the tools of psychoanalysis and how they can be used in literary analysis. I haven't applied the tools practically here. I haven't given you many concrete examples, and I'm happy to have that discussion further in class if you're in my class currently. I have set up a Google form for you in our classroom that you can go into and make some comments, particularly specifically about the characters in our current play, Hansberry's Raisins in the Sun, a raisin in the sun, sorry. So you can kind of make comments on how we might apply this to that play. But if you are not in my class and you'd like to discuss psychoanalysis further, please make some comments below and we'll have a chat in future. I look forward to seeing you all in future videos. Have a lovely day.